my house. They just come to my.
Oh, 4 o'clock. Okay. Well,
Very good, Jake. That's true.
all right, here we go. I'd like to call to order the City of Saugatuck City Council Workshop for August 9th, 2023. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Leo,
Here.
Gardner,
Here.
Baldwin,
Here.
Dean,
Here.
Muncy,
Here.
Lewis,
Here.
Stamp.
Here.
Very good. We have quorum. Item 3, do we have any agenda changes, any additions or deletions to our agenda? Hearing none, we'll move to 4. I don't believe we have any guest speakers slated for this afternoon. So that takes us to item 5, public comment on agenda items only. We will limit our comments to 3 minutes and leave them to focus them on agenda items. Is there anyone in the audience that wishes to offer public comment? See no takers in the room. Any public comment coming in from the Zoom? Please raise your hand. See no hands raised. Jamie, I don't see any hands raised. Okay, that will close our first public comment period of the afternoon. That takes us right to discussion items. 6A, Historic District Commission appointment. It's on page 2. It's fairly self-explanatory. Ryan Cummins and I and the chair, Tim Straker, interviewed Laura Godfrey recently. Prior to that, we had interviewed another candidate, Rosemary Johnson, and the consensus was to go with Laura Godfrey to join the Historic District Commission. Any discussion on that?
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. The Historic District Commission appointments are of great interest to me of being in the Historic District. And a couple questions regarding the process. I know we followed the city policy. I appreciate that. Thank you. I do want to understand and help me understand the comparison and contrast that was done between Godfrey and the other candidate, Johnson. I know Johnson was interviewed last summer, July, maybe, if I recall correctly. So the question there is, did the current mayor and the zoning administrator have a personal interview with Johnson?
We interviewed Johnson previously, and I don't recall the date.
Yeah, so that was a few months ago. So
Yeah.
that it was all the same interviewers, same questions, nothing changed in that regard.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So help me understand, compare and contrast between the two candidates.
Well,
And why Godfrey rose above.
yeah, I have a note here from Tim Straker. I'll read it. Scott Ryan, I'm following up on our interviews for the Open HDC seat. After interviewing both Laura Godfrey and Rosemary Johnson, my recommendation for this opening would be Laura. The current mix of commissioners who live in the historic district versus the village of Saugatuck is 4 out of 7, which is a majority ratio. So I weighted the decision on our equally important additional criteria, including overall capabilities matrix of current commissioners, clear understanding of our guidelines with the ability to interpret accordingly with consistency, professional background, proven skills to manage a tough dialogue with peers and applicants, i.e. board experience tends to be a good gauge, ability to be effective peer-to-peer inside as well as an effective influencer outside. The above criteria plus Laura's early immersion in the historic district of Oak Park, Illinois, and our emphasis on objectivity in decision-making with DOI guidelines as a foundation make her more ready for the seat. I appreciate Rosemary's interest and would love to continue to have dialogue with her as another seat becomes available. I particularly appreciate her local efforts and connections with the community. That's from the chair, and I concur with his viewpoint.
Thank you. I appreciate that information. And I just want to make sure that there's complete clarity around the process as well as for the applicants. And I would expect that anybody that is not selected gets feedback in terms of what the selection process ended up being in those criteria. Particularly, I think it's important for people to understand.
Anything else? No. Excellent. That will be on your agenda Monday for a vote. Next item will be 6B, 4th of July event presentation. Ryan, do you want to kick this off or we could turn it right over to legal counsel?
I can certainly kick it off, Mr. Mayor. Thank you so much. Council directed staff to have a independent review and opinion on whether the city's expenditures for the 4th of July celebration complied with the relevant procedural requirements set forth in the city charter and the code of ordinances. We have done that work. We did provide a legal memo to all of council. Hopefully it's 15 pages. Hopefully you had a chance to review that. That is a public document. So if anyone wants to see that, we can certainly provide it. And Fahey Schultz, Mr. Chris Patterson is ready to talk about this request and give a brief PowerPoint presentation.
We did break down the report into slides just because one of the interesting questions about this is a factual one. There are a lot of meetings and buildup, so the report is long and documenting that. We thought the slides might be easier for you to digest, as well as those members who want to understand what exactly we were doing in sort of looking and reviewing this. And then I think the second piece too, with respect to the document, in analyzing the charter sort of provisions and breaking down really the categories into those that are under $10,000 and those that are over $10,000, the latter part of the actual written sort of longer narrative looks at individual invoices. And here my presentation is sort of really focused on the highlights. And then I think what I'll do is I'll go through these 40. You maybe haven't read the whole 15 pages or something will come out to you, and we could probably have questions and discussions afterwards. If there's something that really is a burning desire to get answered on a specific slide, I mean, I'm happy to stop and sort of take a look at it. Now, this was also designed for purposes of a PowerPoint. There is a slide that has the actual invoices on it if we have to look at them. We've given them, so we'll do a little bit of changing on the tabs if there's some individual invoice that you desire to take a look at. The two sort of important probably backdrops is that we're only legal counsel. So I think there was discussion early on when we were working with the city manager related to sort of what the term is used as an audit. And I guess technically, probably if you look at the dictionary of the term of an audit, we can do a legal audit, but our review is really a written report of determining the lawfulness of the policies and the procedures. We would then rely on sort of the treasurer's information that was reported out of his office. And it really is the numbers that we looked at for the expenditures. And then we collected data from the city manager for purposes of the actual invoices, the contracts, and some of the other materials that you see referenced in that longer narrative. In addition to that, you'll see that in the actual narrative itself, we did rely on not only the minutes, but also the videos, because the specific deliberation and the discussion kind of helps develop. Remember that under the Open Meetings Act, minutes themselves are supposed to record really just the actions taken and whether there was discussion. So to figure out sort of full knowledge of what was going on among council as this sort of persisted towards July 4th, we did have a staff member go and individually look at the videos. And then we didn't do this on the slides, but if you look in the report, you'll see the actual minutes, the sections that would be cited to support that section. If we can look at go to the next slide, obviously we'll go to the one that has next slide here again. So for purposes of one more slide, looking at, you have one that says budget contributions. This is where the PowerPoint, you're going the wrong way, go up.
So where do you want me to go?
Go up one more, this way.
The other way.
Yeah. Okay, page 2. So invoices and contracts we looked at, city council meetings, minutes, recording, and agendas. And then also there were some miscellaneous expenses that are on the treasurer's report. So not everything was recorded in just invoices and contracts. Also, we have the items that were on the actual credit card statements. So go ahead to the next. So then we sort of took a look at all the individual meetings that we were aware of where there was discussion in the 4th of July. Of course, Jake Whitty and myself were actually at some of these, so we had personal knowledge of tracking down a few of these. And then we did coordinate with Ryan with respect to his city manager's reports is where some of the information is to try to determine exactly when votes were taken by council, what information was provided. So if we go to the May 3rd meeting, I'm not going to go over all of the sort of, so I think, this is only 20 and there should be 40. So that's probably why we're skipping slides.
Okay.
I can pull it
Yeah.
up and. Sure. let's
Okay,
see.
I wonder if that would explain why they don't exactly align with what I have. So
Should we, I don't know how we do this, but should we move on to, is it possible to
I
park?
can do that
6B?
and then I can re-forward the actual full slide.
Let me check one thing,
Okay,
because that's the one that you emailed me today. But let me see, I've got another copy that Ryan emailed me the other day. So that one has 20 as well.
20.
So
Okay.
I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
let me double check, see if I can get it sent over. Maybe it's being hacked over with PowerPoint. Mine's got it for you that, so let me, I can probably set it.
Given this is a workshop, do we need to go through some formal tabling process or can we just park this until we,
I think you can park it. Okay, well, let's see when we get to return here in a second.
all right. So it's okay for us to then move on to C and D?
Correct.
All right, let's do that. All right. 6C, Clearbrook Youth Golf Outing Sign Request. This is on page 10 of the packet.
Pretty straightforward. They do it every year, right? My understanding.
Anything you'd like to add on this?
No, Mr. Mayor, Jamie received this request. I will mention that we did receive some emails about the fact that this event is taking place in the township. I think it was Mr. Gardner who had sent that email. Mr. Gardner referenced a policy. We did try to research if there is a policy, whether or not the city can place a banner at the pellet sign. I think maybe like past practice, we couldn't find a policy, but perhaps it was past practice where they did not allow that. The one thing we did flag is that there was an event but for the Saugatuck High School in 2021 that took place at the putt-putt course. I'm sorry that I forgot the name of the course. So that took place in the township and the city did place a flag, a banner. So those are the only comments that I have, Mr. Mayor.
Okay. Any discussion from the council on this?
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, thank you. Appreciate the city manager responding to that email I sent last night. There was really two things. My recollection is that when I say policy, there's a practice, or there had been a practice that the city had not approved event and banners for events that were not either benefiting a Saugatuck organization or two is taking place in the city of Saugatuck proper. The Saugatuck High School event, I think, would qualify because the Saugatuck Public Schools are within the city of Saugatuck, even though the event was outside. I did suggest that maybe going back and looking at maybe the past 2 to 3 years of event approvals to see if we've gone outside of that practice. I recall this being a discussion back when I was in council previously. So I think it's been a longstanding practice. And it makes sense to me because eventually, if you were to continue to set that precedent, then what's to stop someone from Fenville or someone from the Goose Fest, for instance, which is a fantastic festival, probably would appreciate the publicity in Saugatuck. So that's reason, I believe that's the reason why that's been a practice. So I appreciate seeing if there's been any events that have been approved previously that didn't meet that criteria.
Well,
If
with
I
all
may.
due, I'm sorry, if I may, with all due respect, I will let you know that Operation Hope for Allegan does help out our schools. They do a great backpack program every year. And they are a good benefit for this community. So I read the email as well, and I started thinking it might be a good idea to stay near home and with groups that do benefit our area. But I've seen Operation Hope for Allegan and the things that they do for the kids in our schools. And I think they do good work. So I at first I was going to reply. I saw that email from Bill Hess that you replied to. But I decided, oh, wait a minute. I went to their Facebook page, and I know I've had them on the show before. And I thought, well, they do a lot of help around here. And Clearbrook, a lot of the folks that work there, they live here in town. And so I don't think that's too outside the zone. I think if it came up to, an event in Fenville that, wasn't, I think that's a lot further out. So I don't have a problem with it.
I was just going to say the same thing. Operation Hope for Allegan Youth is Allegan County. And we are a part of that. They just happen to help our surrounding communities. So I'm in favor of being able to put a sign up.
So I would align myself with council members Stanton and Muncy. And I would also like to say that I was one of the organizers for the event that was at the Saugatuck Mini Golf, and that was organized by Rotary, and it benefited the Boys and Girls Club, which again, everything doesn't have, we have 1.47 square miles, but we are part of a larger community. And I see us working in tandem with each other, and it's always going to be a positive thing. And frankly, these permits always come up every time. So it's not like we're going to establish something and now we're going to be sued by the city of Fenville if we've refused to promote their wine festival or something like that. So I don't have any concerns about that. I don't see any reason not to approve this.
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, I just would clarify, my opposition is not to the organization.
Oh, that's, I
Really
understand
support the
that.
mission of the organization. thinking of a city in terms of where our limits are, in terms of what we can allow to take place within our,
It's
that's exactly where I'm coming from.
It's a good point, and to your defense, it would be a good idea to, if we had some kind of guideline, which would include the situation here with Operation Hope. But it might be a good idea to have a few guidelines so that we aren't stuck at advertising an event in Benville or another outside city. So I think it's good to stay close to home. I think this is close to home, the organizations and I think Clearbrook is close enough.
Yeah. And Mr. Mayor, could I suggest that we instruct the city manager and city staff to draft a policy for us to be able to review for go forward requests?
Go ahead.
May I would suggest that we don't draft a policy because to both of your points, and also Lauren's, we're tri-communities, every organization is different. Everything lands a little bit differently. I don't really think we should hem ourselves in. If the Fenville Goose Festival shows up, I think we say, no, that's pretty easy. We have no problem with that. I think everything should be on a case by case basis because there's just so much overlap, really.
I think this council has the ability to determine and understand the difference. Also, there's been quite a good progression with our three municipalities over the most recent years of working collaboratively together and supporting one another. And this is yet another way of doing that and being very welcoming. It also, it's good for us to remain welcoming to all organizations because we then in turn turn around to them and ask them for help for various endeavors that we have. So I think it's always good to be a friendly neighbor and supporter. So,
Okay, I think I'm sensing the will of the majority of the council here, so I think we'll put this to a vote on Monday. Very good. So
I'm ready, if you want to move back.
you ready, Chris? All right, you have the floor again. We'll return to item 6B. 4th of July event presentation.
All right, well, I feel like the stakes are higher. It should be better the second time.
We got more slides.
Okay, so the actual question that was sort of requested, basically authorization, relevant procedure, city charter, and the code of ordinances. In addition to that, we did look at state law and Michigan Constitution. Of course, but just fundamental municipal law, city's a creature of under the Constitution. There's limits there too. So we kind of addressed all of it as it relates to the process. I already talked about on the next slide, sort of the documents that we looked at to review. And so that kind of take us to like an overall picture, general framework. Early on in this process, you have a budget, right? So city does a budget. You don't have to necessarily be aligned with the budget, but at the end of the year, you're going to do some type of a budget amendment to align it to your actual appropriations or the expenses that you make. So we collected the information. I believe that came from maybe the treasurer. $15,000 is your budget. And then of course, for purposes of the event, in addition to actual funds that you expended, around $13,300 in donations and contributions. The one thing that's short on that list, and some of the pieces we might have in the later slides, there were in-kind contributions that were provided, the value of those. There are also at least 2 expenditures that I'm aware of that aren't in that donation list specifically that were also provided as just ancillary items that came up as a part of providing the event. So there are even more community contributions than are what's reflected. Those are actual whole dollars that you got in the door. The event ultimately came in, according to the treasurer's price, at about $59,000. And then I think the last sort of piece of it, there's a lot of authority for purposes of the city holding events. It wasn't specifically raised for purposes of our request of the legal procedural process, but there is always a question whenever cities authorizing or appropriating money, is it even a lawful expenditure to have appropriated it? MCL 123-851 specifically even addresses 4th of July celebrations. And then there is Supreme Court precedent for purposes of exactly, if you're going to hold a celebration that has a public purpose that's providing benefit to your community, it's an appropriate expenditure for purposes of your tax dollars. So that sort of removes the question of, can the city actually expend the money on this type of event? And the rest of it is really a procedural question. Did you follow proper procedure as required in the charter and the code of ordinances for purposes of really authorizing those expenditures, those being under 10,000, those being over. And then really those two categories can break down into, you have invoices and then you've got contracts. So if we look at the next slide, it'll tell you that we're going to talk about the meetings. Ultimately, I think it's a pretty factual discussion because we need to figure out what did city council approve or authorize, and then what was provided and disclosed. That's particularly relevant if you read the report for expenditures under 10,000, the explicit approval process of council is less exacting than it is for over 10,000. So just looking at even the discussion points that are happening with council and council's deliberation with the city manager is pretty helpful in understanding the disclosure and sort of what exactly you were expecting would be the cost of the event. So from what we can track down, most of the conversation starts around May 3rd. In that part of I'm not going to read these to you, but you'll see in the report, we tried to footnote and let you know who was present at the meetings and exactly how the vote went. There's really two specific votes that you'll see are taken throughout this process. Those were done with roll call votes. And so you can go look at the full report if you want to see who was present and what the votes were. But all votes that were taken on this process were unanimous. There weren't any objections. And there were just potentially people who would have been absent at any sort of given meeting in the process. So May 3rd, the city manager does report to council that ultimately there's a volunteer coordinator for the 4th of July that wouldn't be able to organize. And so we're going to have to take over the process of organizing and putting the contracts together for the fireworks event. City council during the May 3rd meeting has a lot of discussion about, really most of it was focused on the extent to which fireworks having combustibles was going to be a problem. It wasn't really focused on like why we wouldn't take up the event or why we wouldn't want to offer it to the city. And a lot of the conversation really is what I think led to then the hybrid event that you offered. All of that sort of stems from the May 3rd deliberation. There was concerns about environmental impacts, concerns about just noise impacts to the city by having combustibles. And so the conversation went to the alternate sort of displays, whether you could do drones or whether you could do laser shows. And one of the problems that was immediately even identified by the city council was the extent that if we were to even do a hybrid with a drone display, was going to be the cost. And so I think you decided on during that meeting that maybe tracking down lasers at that time along with fireworks would even be more prudent and reasonable from a cost measure than really doing sort of some type of drone lit show. When we get to the May 8th meeting, at that point, city manager, a lot of this is reported in the city manager's report, is indicating the conversations related to securing, and sorry, one thing to step back. In the May 3rd meeting, council did, after understanding the costs that would be roughly associated with the drones, basically agreed to conduct the hybrid show. In the May 8th meeting, the city manager then starts to sort of put down the details as to what the vendors are going to look like. So at the May 8th, city council gets reported by the manager, the laser vendor. So you know that you have a laser light vendor. You had to obtain multiple permits, although really the expenditures on that are pretty minimal. If you look at the treasurer's report, that's really more of a time and an effort and a planning issue. And then in addition to that, you're still looking for a fireworks vendor, and then you're reaching out for really the contribution piece of it. It's pretty clear early reflected on that council was interested in not only holding the event, but you were looking for contributions and donations, not only to your neighboring municipalities, but also from the community. Now, the period before, and you will know much more than me historically of what you offered as far as city services in the prior 4th of July, but you were roughly running somewhere around $25,000 even in donations to assist the event. I think that's interesting because as I reflected in an earlier slide, you only ended up getting $13,003. So even as you sort of were historically trending as of May 8th, donations ended up coming in 50% of what you had previously would have had expectations for. There is an actual motion made by council, roll call votes taken. It was, I think, unanimous approval. You appropriated the $10,000 and then separately allowing the manager to sign all appropriate contracts and negotiate with the appropriate vendors. That's the and allowance and the authorization of the contracts is an important piece because that's starting to check the boxes when you get to authorizing the contracts, especially over $10,000 appropriations, the section that's listed in the code, which we excerpted those pieces in your written report. Now, after that motion is made, city council actually discusses a full budget. And at that point, you already start to get a rough outline of what it's going to cost. Now, What the manager provides you at that May 8th meeting is the idea that you've historically spent about 15,000 on fireworks. My memory at May 8th is that possibly the manager was already indicating to you the previous vendor might not be an option because of timing. So vendor was still up in the air, roughly 15,000. You have a separate cost of approximately 20,000 for the laser light show. And then music was being estimated at 4,000 to 5,000. And you're still on your effort of looking for private donations and contributions. So at that point in time, council is aware and you're having discussions, it's going to be maybe in excess of $40,000. May 17th ends up indicating that you did confirm the fireworks vendor, and then city manager gives you an updated list of the cost. This one's a little bit more specific and actually interesting if you look at the list. So barges are in it, which weren't in it from the meeting before. You've got a discussion there for $8,000. In addition to the laser show, your music number has been solidified from 4,000 to 5,000. And then the stage rental and the lighting for 20,000. Now, remember that this data is already all being collected under that prior motion and vote by council saying, look, go appropriate, find the vendors, execute the contracts, and you've got disclosure of the amount of your expenditures. The part that gets important, and we'll sort of break this down in the end, is that some of these are currently estimates that the city manager is giving you. But when you look at the individual invoices and the contracts, it gets important that actually many of the invoices and the contracts are under 10,000. The group of them that are over 10,000 is in a pretty small basket. You've got stage rental and lighting estimated at 20,000. It actually comes in less than that. And then poster and design at somewhere between 1,000 to 1,500. So there was no sort of total issue with the cost, but you actually had a lot of deliberation and discussion about the stage rental. I think it was because based on the estimated cost, some of you had in your own experiences worked with other vendors and you thought that potentially you could lower those costs, but you're still talking dollars at that time being discussed really in excess of 55,000, really 60,000. I think the total amount is probably even closer to 7 if you add up those slides. But again, you're still thinking that you're going to be getting contributions. You're trying to work with the local communities on donations, and you haven't yet. You don't really start getting that information until June. May 22nd, city manager then reports that you have finalized the extent that it will be a hybrid show, and you do get updated quotes. Some of these quotes are starting to be based on the invoices and the contracts that have been submitted to the city for purposes of review. So fireworks, night magic, the parenthetical relates to your vendor. You ended up switching. I don't think it's your prior vendor. 15,000, the laser show at 18. You had to have 4 barges, 2 for the fireworks, 2 for lasers. The music DJ, including the actual artist, is disclosed. And then you've got lighting and staging at around 10,000 plus the posters. I think the poster invoice was coming in at a little bit of influx because you were getting some in-kind services donated even as a part of that process. At the same time, provided an update that your current awarded contributions was 10,000. There was a discussion that you had made requests to both your adjacent communities and you were awaiting any response on that. And that essentially we were hoping to sort of pick up some big dollar sponsors, but that if you didn't get them, this was going to be coming from city general fund expenditures to pay for it. No further actions taken by city council to change the original vote that was taken in early May. May 26th, one of the laser show contracts come in. That's an actual contract, but it was already authorized previously by council. And then we'll get to the fact in June, council takes another roll call vote, at least related to the actual event itself. June 7th, sort of light discussion at this point. Really, it was an update about you were getting the flyers out, the social media event as to what the full focus of the itinerary was. And you got an update on the donations and the contributions that were still sort of slowing down. They weren't coming in at a rate to really get beyond what was disclosed to you at the May 22nd meeting. June 12th, you actually took another roll call vote, unanimous approval. You have 1 member absent, and at the June 12th event, you end up approving the event to take place, and surrounding that approval, you'll see the additional details in the report, but you have sort of another full disclosure of what's going to happen, what the events are that'll take place, and then you end up approving the event taking place. I don't think there was any further discussion after the motion and the vote. The 21st, city manager comes back in at that point with the approval for really the signage and the banners to be able to put those throughout the city. And that does disclose both laser show, discloses the fireworks show, and then also your DJ. And all of that stuff is then authorized by council. I don't remember personally if I was at the 21st or the meeting before. I think at one of those meetings, I remember the actual flyers were brought in and circulated because I only remember commenting and seeing them. So it may have been part of the 21st discussion as well. On the 26th, we end up with one of the main contracts being signed, and then we have we have actual approval of the signage. Again, another unanimous approval, no further like deliberation or concerns for purposes of having it. Now, I will say that in the week and a half leading up to the 4th of July, there was a lot of work being done by staff related to the permitting pieces. Now, again, like you don't really have an expenditure listed for that. There was a lot of staff time that was spent on that. So after the 26th, you really don't end up with another meeting until after the 4th of July. So that's sort of your last set of meetings. You essentially, if we counted the dates, probably discussed the event since May at almost every meeting. And you really took motion votes as to the 4th of July event, and then as to the original appropriation and 2 different votes. You had a 3rd vote that really looked at authorizing the signage itself. So granted, that's not an expenditure authorization, but just a disclosure reaffirming the prior 2 votes that had occurred. I just put pictures in here related to the actual 4th of July event. So you can see service contract, DJ performed that part of their contract, laser light show performed their part. And then another picture of the music. There on the recap. So we ended up, the recap discussion really includes a number that's a total of 54,750. This is a list of items that was calculated immediately after the 4th of July. The treasurer's report also includes some additional items that have come in since. That's the original number that we calculated on the first set of slides. The invoices are there, but if anybody has any specific questions about them, we can pull them up. But really, all of the invoices, of course, is a service that's invoiced to us. It's separate from a contract. So you have a set of invoices that we discuss in the report. Most of those are under 10,000, and it's different than potentially the contracts, which there are some contracts over 10,000 that are included in the city council's approval and appropriation to authorize Ryan to do so. When you look at the quoted sections, which we have in the full report and in a few slides, you'll see that it's consistent with what is required, given that the city manager is actually your default purchasing agent. I included this additional slide just related to the lawful expenditures. Really, the piece here is to indicate to you that for purposes of a public expenditure, it's really, did you do something for the community for which you're in? And I quoted some sections out of the letter from the Visitors Bureau in the next 2 slides that just sort of shows the recap of some of those terms are sort of interesting because I don't know that they read the Supreme Court case, but you'll actually find language that's pretty parallel to the lawful expenditures that come from some of the Supreme Court's analysis and deciding really what is a public interest, what's an appropriate expenditure. So I'm not saying that this attests that all those things happened at the event, but at least one person's indicating some of the value, local business, community vibrancy, enrichment, all things that really a city expenditure would be doing for your local community.
And Chris, I think I should just point out, I mean, we value all citizen feedback, but this feedback comes from the executive director of the Saugatuck Douglas Area Convention and Visitors Bureau. So someone that has a vested interest in making sure that we do put on events in the community that support the businesses.
Absolutely. So then city code provisions. So the way that this breaks down, of course, our kind of ultimate document, you're a home rule city. Under the Home Rule Cities Act, you would establish a charter, and your main sort of formal governance document is the charter. And then on the charter, you sort of put leaves on the branch by having a code of ordinances, and those code of ordinances kind of always fill in the additional sort of specific details. So really, for purposes of the charter, it's not surprising that there's a lot of just general authorization that's pretty true with most home rule cities. The one is that, you know, as council, you're allowed to enter into contracts on behalf of the city and that contracts are to be approved except as otherwise authorized by ordinance. So really, that's your general framework. Other than that, obviously, city council appropriates funds. You have other statutes that have you budget the process. So that budgeting and those appropriations piece is all going to be left separate from really the authorization of an actual expenditure. When we get to the city code of ordinances, the coded sections are in your report. That's why it's sort of longer when we kind of like to use the verbatim language. But really, the key pieces, first of all, is you have to look at, so when you designate the city manager to take up the issue, like how much authority does the city manager have? That's the first issue we look at. In this situation, there's kind of two different areas. One, there's literally a section that describes the office of the city manager, just like there's one for the mayor, there's one for other council members, there's also one for the city attorney. We looked at that section in addition to, there's a separate section that's in the code of ordinances that reflects the purchasing policy. And at the outset of that section, it denotes the city manager as your purchasing agent, and actually as purchasing agent gives them, they obviously have, no matter what, fiduciary duties to council and to the city, but they have a lot of authority in engaging in especially invoices and expenditures that are below 10,000. And then contracts over 10,000, there's a separate section. It also allows city manager, for purposes of their own necessary rules, requesting purchase orders. There's no specific rules or procedures that we reviewed that we're aware of that exist from the city manager on that point. And then in addition to that, the council has the authority, there's a provision to even denote additional authority in the city manager for purposes of executing invoices and contracts. So when we're into the code of ordinances now, right? And the code breaks it down into under 10,000, over 10,000. And what we're specifically talking about is expenditures. What the code is concerned about is the approval to have appropriated and sort of obligated the city to spend the money. We're not talking about the formality of contract reviews or the substance of the contracts, et cetera. The code is sort of neutral in that aspect, in that it doesn't matter whether it's an invoice, we could do a handshake deal. The real key is like, was the $10,000 authorized to be actually spent, or was it 8,000, whatever it was in the individual amounts. So in your black letter law of the actual expenditures under 10,000, this is in section 3215, city manager as your purchasing agent would have the authority to have expenditures and enter into contracts for less than 10,000. We won't go there yet, but we're going to get to a slide that I think is even more convenient. It's at the end of your report. We built a little table that makes it very quick to just compare the invoices against the requirements. So you'll see how, like, what am I talking about when I say the invoices and contracts under 10 and which ones are over, and it'll explain to you which provisions of the code applied and whether you satisfied them or not. The other important piece to remember with respect to purchases is that you have competing bidding requirements. So if you were to read the face of the code of ordinances, you would say, why is it that we wouldn't engage in a competitive bidding process where we required to, et cetera? So we did look at all those provisions. They are quoted in the report for you. Your competing bidding requirements actually have several exemptions that are going to apply to the various pieces here. So what we did is we looked at the individual expenditures and we tried to break them down under which exemptions would apply, which I'll get to in a second. But most importantly, the exemptions that you have for competitive bidding, one is that it's not related to a public work or improvement. So that would mean that really what the code is saying, if you are doing a public work or improvement, they want you to be competitively bidding it, right? So putting an RFP out, getting contractors to respond to that, whether it's replacing a street or a water main, whatever it might be. That is especially true with respect to whether there's no advantage that the city could receive from competitive bidding. I think that's particularly on point here, because if you do look particularly at stages and lighting rental, you even deliberated among council to try to get the best deal. So I think you were even concerned about reaching that. And you already had authorized at the early May meeting to proceed forward and get contract vendors without requiring competitive bidding. You are allowed to waive the requirement under this exemption. So I think it equally applies. In addition to that, for purposes of fireworks, you were doing this 60 days in advance. So the number of vendors, I don't think that from our perspective, what the advantage of the city competitive bidding it, the real question was, could you get a vendor there who could do your fireworks on the day that you were trying to do it and didn't already have a contract in another municipality? anything that involves an artist, so you had a specific artist that you're selecting, clearly that within itself wouldn't require it. City council didn't also, I mean, you didn't approve a motion to require it. And the same could be said related to the laser light show. Now, the ones that are probably more on point is actually contracts involving the employment of professional services. If you look at the expertise and the licensing and the qualifications of your, you didn't all see these documents, but the person who did your laser light show is an individual licensed individual. They have an exemption with the FAA to do these types of items. They're experienced and qualified. Fireworks operators also have specific licensing and professional expertise. And then similarly, your artist is a service that's being provided by a professional. The DJ is not, I mean, it's somebody who has a particular skill or a craft that's going to fall within that exemption. So we listed all the exemptions. There's 2 exemptions that apply to really most of all of the expenditures. And then, of course, as it relates to the miscellaneous items, things that the city opts to undertake the work itself. So I'm sure you had Public Works. I mean, this isn't tallied in the treasurer's report, but anybody involved in staff who took the time, especially even during the parade, all of that stuff would fall under the exemption as well related to this process. So we're nearing the end here. With what we tried to do, this is a little small for you. It's actually in a pretty nice size in your report. We broke down the actual vendors and the cost. So this is all under 10,000. We went down each individual one. The real question here, I'll just break down these columns. So who is the authority to contract? So by the time May comes around and you have the motion, that authority to then enter into the contract is left with the city manager, who did end up executing those. And these are all under 10,000, at least according to the invoices that we had. You had DJ at 3,500, individual contract actually with the flight situation, barges, lighting and staging, food, transportation, barriers, although this is an interesting one. It's not a direct cost as it relates to the event. There's some overflow, and there's also a safety exception. So I think barriers are ultimately a pretty important issue that could relate to that. Similar with respect to event coordinator and the safety component with respect to coordinating not only the event, but with your public safety agencies that were in the area. You obviously had a designated lead for that as well. Expenditures over 10,000 is really the next category. Basically, the big key difference here is that 10,000, they're going to be approved by council. So you're going to look at those 2 motions, the one in June, the one in May, and then all purchases that would be over 10,000 that are made by a written contract and would be subject to competitive bidding. Now, we don't have that here because I discussed the exceptions to competitive bidding. And then I also discussed the exceptions. And so not everything had to be in a written contract, but actually you did get your expenditures over 10,000 in a written contract. So if we go to the analysis of the expenditures over 10, you're only talking, as far as we're aware of, really 2. So Night Magic, which I guess we could have listed really more easily as your fireworks vendor, but you've got your fireworks vendor and you've got your laser light vendor. Both those contracts were over 10,000. And then in the table, we list to you, first, you specifically did a roll call vote approving the entry of all contracts, and you're allowed to appropriate the execution of those to the manager. You do have the ability, if you so desire in the future, you can require and specifically indicate in the motion the contract comes back, but that what your direction was actually to the city manager as purchasing agent to take those issues up. And then we've got the exceptions listed there as well for purposes of competitive bidding. So at the end of the day, our conclusion that you'll see in the report, proper procedures to make the expenditures. Like, I think this is important because what we really are looking at is where all of the individual expenditures, those under 10,000 and over 10,000, properly authorized by the time you analyze all of those meetings and you look at really the 3 votes that city council did take. And the one I think we don't rely on, the one related to approving the signage, it's really the other 2 that are the focus that we think supports the analysis. And then, of course, council itself specifically authorized the manager. You didn't have to. I mean, certainly you could have had everything come back to you. But if you do authorize the manager who has the power under the city code as a purchasing agent to undertake some of this authority on its own, then you are going to end up with compliance with the provisions that you did. And then I think, we did read some commentary related to exceeding the budget. And I think the budget was exceeded, what I said, like 33,000, at least on a current count. It does happen. But there's nothing in the city code or the charter when you're doing an expenditure that makes the actual expenditure unlawful for having exceeded the budget. You're obviously going to have to do a budget amendment at some point to reflect sort of where exactly that additional money would be appropriated. There's a much longer, more detailed analysis that's in the report that has the code section. So that's sort of high level, but if you've got questions, we tried to put footnotes even in there to sort of help you if there were things that maybe would assist in questions or comments you would have had at the time.
Thank you, Chris.
Yes.
Any questions for Chris?
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, again, thank you. This is exactly what I would have expected us to see. It's a bit detailed in terms of process for us, but it's important for me to be able to to be able to explain to my constituents and the people that have been talking about this, that the city substantially complied with its policies and procedures as it relates to expenses and our approval of that process. This substantially, I think, supports that argument. And I also look at this as an opportunity as a council member to learn. What did I learn from this? One thing I learned is the city should not sponsor special events. That's been talked about in past meetings as well. I think the city is better positioned to provide services to our residents and citizens. All the basic things of municipal management. Sponsoring special events is not something we should be getting into the business of. Two is that there should have been at the time a goal to find, I know one of the slides talked about this, I don't know which organization backed out. I don't want to misquote anything here, but there should have been at that point, the goal should have been to find some organization to sponsor it. I mean, in retrospect, that's something I've now learned is that if a situation like this arises, that really should be the council's direction. Is we need to find someone that can help sponsor, not that the city would just step away from it completely because we make financial contributions, but that's where I think that in retrospect, I probably should have said, maybe it's something we need to talk about. Also too, for items over $10,000, I would go forward. I would expect proposed contracts to be presented to council for approval, especially for events of this nature. There are potential risks for the community from a liability standpoint that I think the council should be aware of for things of this nature, especially like fireworks and lasers, and things that are, potential risk for folks. You mentioned some of the compliance that they had to do in terms of FAA and other things. I think the city just needs to be in a better position. Council particularly needs to be in a better position to understand what that contract covers us for from a liability standpoint, et cetera. And I say I've also learned a better understanding of the spending and expense management process for the city. I've learned a lot more about our processes and our procedures and policies. Last question I have for you is who was interviewed for this review?
Yeah, I can answer that. Let me go back to one thing you said about special events. The one thing I would comment, special events, is a pretty broad category.
Right.
If you look at MCL 123-851, what I think is really interesting about that statute is it seems to have already identified a very specific list of
Yes.
events that it think is appropriate for lawful expenditures. So I just, special events is a broad brush to paint with. I think if you look at the statute, it's kind of interesting that they seem, the legislator seems to have identified at least 4 events that they think
Veterans
are
Day, Memorial Day,
Correct.
4th of July, and
right. So I do think, that I think is strong support for suggesting that really these types of expenditures are in line with that, even that statute that's identified those special events. As far as the interviewing process, really for purposes of, one, I suppose we all indirectly interviewed you by watching way too many minutes of you deliberate on this process. We have copious notes of that process, looking at what you discussed and what was presented. And then really it was just a document driven process. The one thing to remember about the procedures, those processes and procedures don't really reflect whether oral representations are sufficient to satisfy the expenditure. So I don't know that interviews would have got us anywhere. We did get documentation. What would happen is we would look at the treasurer's report and have questions like, where did this come from? Is there an invoice for this? And so we would ask Ryan, where's this? Can we have this? And he would go to the treasurer, and then we would end up getting forwarded documentation from the treasurer with the additional documentation. Because it all kind of came together in different pieces. We ended up getting some of the big contracts initially with the request to take a look at this. Once we started looking at the under 10,000 and the over 10,000, and we're looking at the video recordings, that's where the comments started coming in like, oh, well, there's also a stage and lighting. Is it an invoice? Is it a contract? What was the role of the barriers? Were the barriers used for the 4th of July parade? Were they only used for this event? So there was that back and forth so we could get the additional documentation, but most of it is all driven from your minutes, your videos, and the actual invoices, the contracts. That's what really speaks to what the charter and the ordinance requires.
Yeah, thank you. And Mr. Mayor, just final comment. I want to thank you for taking the first initiative to send this over to the attorneys for review and the follow-up. Thank you very much. And I do want to say that, I'm very humbled and proud of all the efforts that went into this to make this happen. There's a lot of good compliments and joy. I think joy is one of the words that's been frequently used for the event. It just shows another example where this community does step up in situations of need. So, and I thank the community for that. Thank you.
Anything else from the council? Well, Chris, I'd just say thank you for this. Once again, I regret that we had to spend the time and the money to have this review done. But when people make allegations about a lack of transparency or a lack of compliance from this council, I feel it needs to be answered and answered appropriately. And it's probably part of the reason this was a fairly easy effort to do is because we had legal counsel here every step of the way. We had a lawyer here at every meeting. And the lawyer, I'm sure, had we made a misstep, would have brought it to our attention. So this tracks exactly with my recollection of the events from May leading up to July. I regret that we had to spend this money, but transparency and maintaining the public's faith in this council is paramount to me. So thank you, Chris, and thank you to your team for doing this piece of work for us.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, with that, we will go to our final discussion item, North Shore Development Letter, page 12. We've got the letter. Ryan, anything you want to add?
No, Mr. Mayor, you have a cover page for this item. So City Council agreed to provide a resolution, public comment to Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy as it relates to the North Shore development. Your legal staff put a lot of time into this and it will be up for your vote on Monday.
As you all know, I will not participate in that vote since the document would be going to my employer. So anything on this?
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, I would just, I reached out to David Swan yesterday and I just want to clarify for everybody's understanding is that the public comment period closed July 20th. And I had a question as to whether that was still open for Saugatuck and other interested parties. His response to me was that Eagle has not yet made a decision and they specifically requested comment from the city as an adjacent riparian. So I would say Eagle will accept comment. I know the State Historic Preservation Office is submitting additional comment next week. So public comment is closed, but Eagle continues to accept evidence and comment. So the city is still able to submit our comments. So thank you.
And this has been reviewed by our city attorneys, correct? Yeah. Prepared for us. Okay.
Drafting.
Go ahead, Chris, you're here. Might as well.
Yeah, happy to comment on that. Actually, it's the timing is interesting because we were also coordinating with the Coastal Alliance on the timing. When we got authorization from council to do it, if you remember, we were like within 5 days of when they were going to actually end published comment. So we were coordinating with the Coastal Alliance to make sure that the comment was still going to get submitted. And there was some background data that we had to get with respect to the actual Eagle application. So we did review it. The actual policy statements, I should say that we drafted it based on the standards, but the actual policy statements all come from the prior resolution that was actually submitted to the U.S. Army Corps. So you will see a lot of the same material, and that was literally on purpose from council's direction to do it as cost effective as possible. We took those policy statements and we actually then wove them into the Eagle standards, which are of course different than what we submitted for purposes of the Army Corps. So it is our understanding if we get it when we have, and I don't know that if you want authorization, if you're going to take this up on Monday, but basically as soon as you guys get done with it, we'll be able to submit it. We understand that Eagle will still consider it.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Great. Anything else on this one?
Happy to see it getting done. Yep, thank you.
All right, this ends our discussion items. This takes us to item 7, public comments, open forum. Anybody in the audience? Bobby, please approach.
Bobby Gaunt, 341 Main Street in Saugatuck. Thank you. Thank you, Chris, and thank all of you. I will add, I spoke with David today, Russ, about your conversation. And everything everyone has said about that is correct, except that Eagle, in a conversation with them last week, said that they hope to have everything in and wrapped up by the 13th. Even though public comment closed, they were still accepting comments. As of today, there are two outstandings. One is us and one is the State Historic Preservation Office. So if council so approves this on Monday, if somebody could email it to Eagle after the meeting, which is the 13th, that would be very much appreciated. Because I just don't want to take a chance.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bobby.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bobby.
Slight correction, Monday is the 14th.
Well,
Thanks.
Anyone else in the audience? Oh, sorry, anybody else in the audience has public comment? Oh, please approach. Just state your name and address for the record, please.
I'm Deborah Gardner, and I would like to bring out a concern that my husband and I have about parking at 256 Spear Street. It's on our east side of our home. My husband bought the property 50 years ago this December. He was such a good neighbor that, in fact, that Jenny Hill gave him a key to this house, which he still has. And on the west side, 234 Spear is a rental. We have no problems with them. We really care about the people at 256 Spear Street. But nobody is put out by them parking for money several times a year, but my husband and I. They're parking and bringing these cars in, and the exhaust is 4 feet from our patio where we sit, where we like to sit. And it's 14 feet from our bathroom and our bedroom. There's only one brother and sister that does this. There is one more owner, their cousin. She has never done it. This affects only, as I stated, my husband and myself. Russell is our nephew, and we value his opinion a great deal. I did call Brian Cumming, I believe it is, about the 4th or the 5th or the 6th of July. I have not gotten anything back from him yet, definitely. Russell told me that he would get back with me, and we, like I said, we do value and trust Russell, but we need something in writing by the 14th. We need to know, is that property, what is it zoned as? You know, my husband he probably would have bought the property because it was his grandmother's, but he wasn't given the opportunity to give any opinion about buying next door to a parking lot. And we really need help with this. It's gone on for years, and I tried to explain to him that you can't let things go because then they think it's a family tradition. Well, our family tradition is respect and approval. And we haven't been given we've never been asked. So there is no approval. So like I said, this is the only problem that we have with them. And she told me that, well, the city loves this. I'm sure. You need a parking spot. Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thanks, Deb.
Anyone else in the audience wishing to offer public comment? Anyone on the Zoom call? I do see one hand raised. I see Vicky's iPhone raised. Is that for a public comment by chance?
Yes, it is.
Please go ahead, state your name and address for the record, please.
Vicky Cobb, 987 Lake Street, Saugatuck. My comments are related to the July 4th event. It was a great review and report that was just given. And one of the things that struck me is every single vote taken related to the July 4th event was unanimous by this board. The cost information was shared at every single step along the way. And all this information was available to the public as well as our city council. So I was sitting here scratching my head wondering why this report was commissioned. The citizens that are complaining about legal expenses are some of the same citizens that were driving the need for this report. It seemed a total waste of legal effort in my mind, and certainly a waste of city funds. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you, Vicky. Is there anyone else on the Zoom call who would like to offer public comment? I see no hands raised. I don't see anything. Anything else, Jamie? No? Okay. With that, we will close our final public comment period. Item 8, correspondence. We have 3 pieces of correspondence in your packs. That takes us to item 9, council comments. Helen, would you like to start?
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you to legal counsel for the presentation. I would echo the citizens' comments. I didn't see a need for it. Everything we did on television. Every vote was unanimous. There was never one thing that was pointed out that we needed to specifically audit from the charter. I regret that we had to spend additional time and money and a waste of our time and legal expenses. Although I am grateful for that, for the I guess excessive transparency. I think everything was already transparent, and I would hope we don't start a precedent that every time somebody kicks their feet, we have to have a legal counsel and a full audit. Thank you.
Thank you, legal counsel, for that as well, for July 4th. And I'm glad, I did believe from the beginning that we did follow procedure, and I'm aware that all of us council folks did approve of these contracts and the celebration. The one thing that I would like to have seen was the revenues to match the expenditures. I was not made aware until after the event of the gap that we had. It would have been nice to have known that, hey, there would have been a red flag, or actually we had asked about a week or 2 before the event where we were at with expenditures and revenues, and we weren't given that information until after the event. And maybe because the forms weren't all filled out, maybe the spreadsheets weren't finished, but I certainly would have liked to have known where we were leading up to the event. I know it was a short time, but if we needed help raising funds, I certainly wouldn't have been afraid to help knock on doors and help get money. Maybe folks that did give every year, maybe they should have stepped up and called the city and said, hey, we want to give to this. But I think it was the responsibility of us to step up and try to meet those expenditures with our revenues. And I think that was the biggest surprise to me. I did not think that there were any laws broken at all, but I appreciate your time with that. On a lighter note, Movie in the Park is this coming Friday, brought to you by Mill Pond Realty. It's a free event for everybody, and we're going to watch Top Gun, the new Top Gun, Maverick. And so I'm excited to see that.
Okay, I would just say, I clearly remember that we had conversations about making phone calls and trying to raise money. So it's my clear memory that we had conversations at least 2 or 3 times at meetings about making calls and using your contacts, reaching out to your network. Other than that, I really don't have any comments.
Thank you, Holly.
I don't have anything at this time.
Russ.
Yeah, just I would appreciate, I concur with Councilmember Muncie's comments about a request for information regarding where we were from an expense and contribution standpoint. That request was asked several times with no response, and that information would have been very helpful in advance of the event, to whether we needed to scale back the event to match the contributions, or whether additional contributions were going to be available.
Garnet.
Yeah, 2 things. First, regarding July 4th expenses, there was an amount of $25,000, I believe, promised by an individual in town that he would go about gathering it from business owners. And therefore, that was being waited upon patiently, and that did not materialize. So, not about throwing people under the bus, but if we're going to be critical, I think it's fair to say, hey, don't make promises you can't keep. Second, Venetian, a great weekend. I'll start with the things we've learned. Laser light shows, for the money, you have to be willing to spend $100,000, and we just don't have that kind of money to spend. So Rotary probably won't do another light show. But we are also, because of our environmental focus, we'll never do fireworks. So we will happily include anybody who might want to help with that endeavor next year. But we will not do fireworks. Second, the boat show, the boat parade. I will publicly say it again on Monday. The Star of Saugatuck pulled out several weeks before the event, and we did everything we could to continue to have that event. But because of a number of things and the lateness of us picking up that Rotary picking up that event, it just didn't materialize. So that's another one that we're more than happy to partner on. My understanding is that the Star, and Diane, I believe is her name, is willing to take that on, and we welcome that. Julie, thank you. I can't keep everybody's name straight. So on the positive, Friday night was an outstanding success. We had 3,000 plus individuals attend in that park. And I think everybody who was here to help us with that massive amount of people. We did not run out of beer, which was a concern based on last year's events. And actually Rob from Cranes at about 9:30 is like, Garn, I've run out of wine. Should I go get more wine? I said, absolutely, go get more wine. And he did that. He ran down and got some more wine. We had 71 dinghies, which is 4+ individuals a dinghy. So 200 some people, like a mass of mad, crazy people dashing across that water. And for the volunteers that worked, whether it was at the Red Dock or over at Tower, they're like, oh my God. There was just this wave of dinghies coming their way. So we are very happy. Our net is about $42,000. We are very happy with that. We sent out a survey asking for folks' feedback, and we've gotten some really good suggestions and ideas. But the feedback overall is very, very positive, and that's the feedback that we're going to focus on. So with that, that's my report.
Great. Thank you, Garnet. Yeah, I really enjoyed Venetian weekend. I really enjoyed the Independence Day celebration. So it was in my book, it was a great July in the city. I've seen nothing but happy people in town and lots of people in town. And, it's a fair question. If people don't want to volunteer, if people don't want to spend money on these events, they don't want to contribute to these events, that's a choice they can make. And, people are more than welcome to, vote with their wallets. And if they don't want to contribute to these events, that's a choice that can be made. But from the city's standpoint, I'm very proud to have sponsored the 4th of July, Independence Day. And I would be very happy if the American Pyrotechnics Association were to come before us next year with an application for a permit. I would welcome that, but we will see what we get next year. And with that, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
I'll make a motion to adjourn the meeting.
I'll second.
Motion Gardner, second Muncy, all in favor, please say yes.
Yes.
Meeting adjourned.